let's get it started just like this. Welcome to the Hardway Project. Step in the ring.
Jason Glast. So to introduce Jason, he is a former PR rep or the PR guy from WCW. He's a lawyer, went to law school, became a PR rep at WCW, and now he's one of the top, if not the top, luxury real estate agents here in San Antonio. So welcome, Jason. Excited that you're here. Welcome.
Thank you, guys. I'm really glad to be here. Really glad to be able to talk about this fascinating chapter in my life.
It's awesome, Jason. And, shout out to Charles for, bringing Jason on board today. What a great, is our first external guest. So we're super pumped to have you here. And I was telling this before the call, like I was supposed to be working today, but my mind was not at work. My mind was thinking about the millions of questions that I could potentially ask Jason of interest, since he had a very unique view of one of the most interesting and I would even dare say one of the most important eras for the industry and endless entertainment for marks like me and Charles. Jason, it's just great to have you here. I'm going to go ahead and start off with a basic question. I looked at your LinkedIn today and your background. I see you've got a University of St. Andrews shirt on. How the hell does a guy like you end up at WCW, man? I got to ask.
It's a great question. And I was specializing in elite education when I was in my early to mid 20s, which honestly, I was a good student, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. When I was in law school, Jerry Maguire was a huge hit, and I decided I wanted to be in sports law or something like that, maybe an agent. I decided, first of all, after law school, I didn't practice law. I did pass the bar, but I decided I wanted to become a sports writer. And so I moved to Colorado. My dad found me a job in Vail, Colorado, and became a sports writer there. And very lucky that my future wife moved there with me. But at some point it was like, okay, I want to get into this business. And I researched and I decided that the best way to pursue this was to get a master's at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, which is basically on the West Virginia border in a little Appalachian town. Beautiful place. I loved their program because it was 9 months and it was all career focused. It wasn't about academics or theory. It was, how are we going to set you up for a job? And the program was wonderful. They had all these connections in college sports, pro sports, and specifically at Turner Broadcasting in Atlanta with both TNT, TBS, and notably WCW.
Did you grow up with it? Did you watch it when you were a kid?
Now, I grew up in Dallas, and when you grow up in Dallas, it's hard not to have at least some knowledge of the Von Erichs, for example, and the famous venue in Dallas, the Sportatorium. So I had a very outsider kind of knowledge, and like many people, kind of looked down on it as maybe, oh, that's not real sports, that's fake stuff. And even going into the job that I got through Ohio University, I had that same little bit condescending feeling that, okay, this is just a real quick pit stop, and I'm going to parlay this into a real job in real sports with Turner Sports. I got hired out of Ohio. First of all, at Ohio, our big project was to run a WCW show that came to the Convocation Center at Ohio University, and that was led by the top PR guy, a guy named Alan Sharp, who was a graduate of that program. And so myself and a few of the other guys, we led this WCW event where we had to do marketing, promotions, ticket sales, and then, event management the day of. That was really the first time that I started to learn about the guys that were coming, such as Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero. I hadn't heard about these guys. I hadn't. Had a friend at Ohio who was a big fan, and he's like, you don't understand. These guys are better performers in the ring than the famous guys that you are familiar with, such as Hulk Hogan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. So I guess, could you describe for us kind of like what your role is? Because I think sometimes people think PR, they think of like you're doing corporate positioning, they think you're doing like mostly external stuff. But during our prep call, you cleared that up. You said, no, man, I did something completely different. And frankly, I thought it was a lot cooler. Can you tell us kind of like your day-to-day, what your general duties involved?
Yeah. So Every other week, I would travel to the Nitro show on Monday and the Thunder show on Tuesday. And I was responsible for engaging the local media in those cities. Sometimes they would want me on camera, where my cliche line was, it's so popular because it's like a soap opera for men. Okay. I hit that line over and over, and I'm not even sure that was the best line whatsoever.
But it's
But then, of
100%
course,
accurate.
yeah, I mean, especially at that
100%
time.
accurate. Yeah.
Because when I arrived, it was July of 1999. We had peaked right before I got there.
Mhm.
The peak of WCW was really like 96 through 98. So I didn't know this at the time, but I was there to see the downfall, which at first was gradual and then right off the cliff.
Mhm.
And that was very interesting to watch. So yes, I would have to then arrange for the wrestlers and other talent on the show to do those local interviews, at the 5 o'clock local news in Cleveland before the show that would start, a couple hours later, things like that. I would also travel to the ticket on sale events. We have a show coming up in Minneapolis. So I go there with some of the talent the day that ticket sales begin, and we do promotions there and autographs and things like that. So that was probably not as big a part of my job. And then the third part was, of course, for me, the most fun, which was travel to celebrity things such as the American Music Awards and Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards. Those were two notable events that I got to travel to, with some of the talent. And that stuff was fun. I have to tell you, it was also excessive because, corporate told me book the finest hotels, bring your wife. It doesn't matter. It's like a blank check. It was outrageous, the lack of fiscal responsibility that existed in the late 90s at WCW.
So as far as the talent, Jason, I know, just prepping that, you had relationships with, a few wrestlers, but talent wise, like what's that big talent in WCW that you just, was just like, this can't be real life? Because you say you weren't a fan beforehand, but then when you got in the business, you're probably like, what in the world is going on here? Like, this can't be real life. What am I doing?
So, of course, one of the guys I was aware of was Macho Man Randy Savage. And my second week on the job, my boss said, okay, here's the deal. You're going to pick up Macho Man, and his girlfriend in real life was also a character on our show named Gorgeous George.
Yep.
And he's like, these are the elements of your job. You've got to book the limo. Okay. And they're going to pick you up first. And then you go to Macho's house. And this is critical. You must know the brand of beer that the boys like to drink. If you screw that up, you're in big trouble. I can promise you, got to get it right. And so literally there was a list. Macho likes Miller Lite, Lex Luger likes Coors Light, on and on and on. Okay. So I knew that Macho liked Miller Lite because I had it on my list. I was very nervous for this, as you might expect, and we were heading to Minneapolis. And my recollection is Macho was actually a Minnesota guy. Or at least he had performed in that region for decades. And so besides being a major star worldwide, Minnesota, really big. So go in the limo to pick up Macho and Gorgeous George. That morning, I've got, 2 cases of Miller Lite in there, and I'm pretty tense, guys. I'm pretty nervous about this experience. So pick up Macho and Gorgeous George. They get in the limo. Hello, my name is Jason Glast. And Macho's like, okay, you're the new Alan Sharp, huh? Okay, brother. And then he looks down at the Miller Lite. He's like, what is this BS? I don't understand, brother. They didn't tell you that I drink Coors only. And I'm like, they told me you like Miller Lite. And he goes, screw this. And he gets on the phone. I'm calling Eric, as in Eric Bischoff, the president of WCW, who I hadn't even met yet, but I've been told is a very scary and powerful individual. Gets on the phone. Eric, I don't know who this little pissant is, brother, but he got the wrong beer. He is done. I'm not even going to goof around with this BS. He's done. Hey, Eric wants to talk to you. Hands me the phone. It was actually my boss, Alan Sharp. So they planned this rib just to break me in. So I, wiped the sweat off. We fly to Minneapolis, and we just had the best day. So whatever, people would say about Macho or whatever, I just adored the guy. great experience with him. He didn't last much longer at the company from that day in Minneapolis, honestly.
Yeah.
But, I just have very fond memories. And when I heard he passed away, I was pretty crushed.
Mm-hmm.
So really great experience that day with him. And he was great, with the fans, the kids. And I think at that point, he was a heel, but it didn't matter. People just gravitated to him and loved him.
Yeah. Amazing. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you. So in professional wrestling, as a PR guy, you kind of have to live in two worlds, right? You have their character and the storyline that they're doing, and then the suspension of disbelief that you kind of, as a communicator, you kind of have to help with that. And then you also have the real talent, the real person, the man or the woman who plays the character. And then you have to interact with the press, right? So did you have to, how was that different than any other kind of experience you had like that? Cause that's a totally unique thing where you have to almost coach the press. Don't ask about this. This is not a shoot. This is a work, right? I'm really interested in learning more about how you kind of straddled both worlds when you were engaging with the public.
Yeah, it's a great question. And in 99, 2000, those lines were very blurred because WWF was making major inroads and starting to really beat us in the ratings through more of reality-based programming, where, the shoot became more the story instead of the suspension of disbelief. WCW was still more old-fashioned. I think our guy was Kevin Sullivan, who was in charge of the writing, and he was old school. So he wanted that suspension of disbelief. But then we had, a lot of the talent, they were paying attention to what was going on with WWF. And so he wanted to make it more real. And so, it was a fine line. I remember one time I brought some cameras back before the show, and I think they filmed the board that showed what matches were going on that night, and Kevin Sullivan lost his mind on me. Was just so angry at me for allowing that. I'm like, you're not getting it. That means nothing. Okay. That's just saying the Spurs are playing the Wizards tonight. It's not even giving away. It's not against kayfabe or anything like that. But Kevin, he didn't like that. He didn't like any of that backstage access. But I could tell, as many other people could, but that was not the way the business was headed. Mm-hmm. Instead, it was more about reality. Truthfully, the more interesting stories were real, and the conflicts that were going on backstage was who was getting the push, who was spiking the ratings. W lived by 15-minute rating blocks that the Nielsen ratings would, all the executives would religiously watch that, and they'd say, okay, Sting popped this number where Goldberg did this, and, Dean Malenko did this. And so that was religion. That was how people thought their careers were being made, in 15-minute rating increments. That was very shocking to me. But we were a live TV show more than just this in-ring product. And, by then there weren't that many. I mean, there were still house shows that weren't on TV, certainly. But for the most part, it was all about Monday night and, Tuesday night to a lesser extent. You mentioned you've got the characters versus the real life personas. That was surprising to me that those were often one and the same.
Wow.
And so people that were living their gimmicks was, probably 75%.
Wow.
And with very little of that they pulled back from that.
We all know the biggest talents, the biggest characters, they're just extensions of their normal everyday.
That's true.
Life.
Just dialed up to 11.
Yep. That's awesome. It really is to throw you, a young Jason Glast that isn't a fan, doesn't really know about wrestling, isn't one of us that isn't a mark, to just throw you in the mix, and you got to figure all this out on the fly. Hey, this is a shoot. This is just the nomenclature itself. To learn the nomenclature, I'm sure it was overwhelming.
I'm glad you brought that up, Charles, because that was one of the things I immediately got into and thought was really cool. I did study that history that came out of carny culture, the way that they would talk, their specific language. And then you learned the handshake that the boys would have. It was the limpest, lamest handshake you could imagine. Just barely touching the other guy's hand. And I'm like, what? And they're like, oh, that's the secret society handshake. That means that you know how to work without injuring the other guy.
Wow.
It's a code.
Okay.
It's a code.
Yeah.
And so literally when I would shake any of the talent's hands, I would have to do that handshake too. And they were like, okay, this guy gets it. This guy gets it.
Nice. So you were obviously accepted after a little bit. I'm sure they give you, they ribbed you and put you through it for a little while, but eventually you kind of worked your way in. Yeah.
And I have to give credit to my boss, Alan Sharp, because he had been there for a long time and he was kind of over it. He was over everything, which I came to understand why, that it had a high burnout factor. So he really allowed me to get out there and, quickly get, ingratiated. And, for the most part, it worked out well. There was still some talent that I never connected with. And I just kind of kept away from that, honestly.
Fascinating. Could you, I've always now, so one of the things that I've learned, since we started this project, I grew up like just focusing on the talent and the storylines, that part of it. Since we started this project, I've actually tried to learn more about the history of the business. I've learned more about TV and how all that works. Could you talk to us a little bit about booking in terms of like, you probably had, I would guess like an outsider's perspective to the actual booking decisions, but you played an instrumental central role in implementing those booking decisions. So I'm kind of interested, how was WCW? I think Kevin was doing the booking at the time. I could be wrong, but kind of, can you give us a sense of how that worked and kind of what your role in was that?
Yeah. So again, Kevin was old school. And so, and he was tight with Kevin Nash, Hulk Hogan, just, so he didn't necessarily have that vision of, okay, here's where the business is going. So we need to push guys for the future.
Mm-hmm.
It was still a little bit stuck in the past. But myself, I would try to book guys for media interviews that I thought had a future. Okay. So I would be like, okay, Vampiro, who was this French Canadian dude that had become legendary in Mexico. And his real name was Ian. And honestly, he was the nicest guy. Everybody loved him. He had a really cool look and he could really perform in the ring. And so I learned quickly that Ian would do anything that I asked of him and gave great interviews, and the media loved him because of his look, so I would be pushing Ian, for example, where Kevin and some of the other, big stars, they didn't really get that or like that very much. So that was just kind of like my way to subtly influence who might get a little more TV time, a little more fame, but the people that were making the true decisions were resistant to that.
You bring up a good point. So me and John Mark, we talk about this. So you take the wrestling of the 80s, right? The 80s and 90s, and wrestling today, it's streamed. You can save it. You can go back and watch it. So you have these long storylines where you have a buildup, right? You build a character over time and you build a storyline over time, and the crescendos at WrestleMania or wherever. Whereas I think WCW kind of like one of their downfalls is that booking, right? They were going like literally show to show trying to get a big pop and not looking months ahead. Whereas I think the WWF, they were in them for the long haul.
And so you're 100% right. And I know some executives at WCW, including Eric Bischoff, and specifically when Bischoff came back the second time. So I was there, when he got fired, and I was there when he came back. And, that second time he more acted like his career was on the line if those 15-minute rating increments didn't really hit. And there were many others that were the same.
Which was probably to his detriment,
100%. They couldn't think long term. They didn't think that way anyway. So they could never just step back and say, all right, this is a year push or a 6-month push. No, they were like, what's going to happen next Monday night? And we need that second hour to somehow hold its own against, Raw, against WWF.
Yeah. I mean, I could feel it, man. Like Charles and I, as Marks, were sitting on the couch, and I mean, literally, like one of my biggest exercises of the day was switching between WCW, and Raw. Like that was the game. And if it really, from my perspective, the moment something got boring, something got lame, I would just switch, right? And when you said that the Nielsen, 15-minute increments, that just gives you an indication of just how freaking competitive it must have been and stressful it must have been on the other side. For us, it was fun. We loved it. I mean, I think the business was awesome back in those days, but like on your end, that must have been excruciatingly painful to have to live like that.
It was, there was a few painful parts of it, but I'd say it's also, when you're caught up in it, it's more like, okay, a basketball analogy. It's the fourth quarter, game is tied, how's this going to turn out? And there's that excitement. And, I can't remember, I wasn't necessarily given those numbers immediately. I think for the most part, I would see the numbers the next day. But I remember this vividly. When Bischoff was first there, he was like Lord Vader. Okay. He was all powerful, dressed in black with a black helmet of hair. It was like this guy, he felt like, how could I ever be dethroned, so to speak? But he absolutely was. And so when he was, morale improved greatly and ratings went up a little bit, but then they started to fall again. So, after this guy named Bill Bush was there, they brought Bischoff back. Okay. And Bischoff shows back up. He seems a little more humble. He's not dyeing his hair black anymore. So he's got his white hair. And so I remember we had a big deal. Big deal in my job was promoting Eric coming back.
Yeah.
Okay, so like our interviews were very focused on that. It must have been that it wasn't any kind of surprise. We were really promoting it. And so I can remember this Nitro versus Raw. And that night was really important with those Nielsen ratings. And I can remember that for whatever reason, I was privy to those 15-minute increments that night. And we popped the best number that we had in, over a year. I was really excited about it. I really didn't connect ever well with Bischoff, but that night I wanted to give him a little attaboy. So I walk into wherever he was posted up, looking, and he was just like slumped over, so sad, like no energy. I was like, Eric, you saw that number? Well, guess what? That number was nothing like he remembered from 96, 97. It was really weak compared to that. So for him, it was a total loss, where for the rest of us, we're like, this is the best it's been in a year. So the ratings controlled everything, most likely to our detriment.
Gotcha. So I'm gonna ask you this, like, I know you worked with, you had a lot of talent, worked with a lot of talent, befriended talent, just working so closely over the years. Who's that wrestler that really kind of gets a bad rap, but behind the scenes you think is just probably one of the greatest people?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Bill Goldberg probably qualifies for that. When I arrived at WCW, I was really shocked to find out that Bill had banned the public relations department at WCW from doing anything with him. So he was our biggest star, and yet we couldn't touch him. And that was because a woman that was, kind of the bottom of our organization, she had messed up a Make-A-Wish kids visit with Bill. And he was very, very upset with that. So he's like, y'all are incompetent. I'm done. Any media must be booked through his LA agent. I was very ambitious. Like I said, I wanted to rise up the ranks really at Turner Sports. WCW was part of Turner Sports. And in fact, we were the highest rated show in the history of TBS. But the Turner Sports people looked down their noses at us. Almost like my condescension when I was coming into it. The real sports guys, they were like, this is the devil we just have to deal with because their ratings are so big. But, they just really dismissed us. They were very condescending to us. And so my thing was, I want to get into Turner Sports. Really, I was very focused on maybe becoming an attorney there. And there were 3 guys who were the attorneys there, and they had a weekly basketball game. I immediately started getting in that game to kind of network and let them know who I was, and maybe that, I work with WCW, but I'm not one of those guys, okay? And the head of Turner PR was a guy named Greg Hughes, and he was in that game too. And so, after a week or so, I was like, hey, Greg, do you know that Goldberg does not deal with our department at WCW? And he's like, absolutely, I do. He let me know in no uncertain terms, a couple of months ago that was the case. I'm like, can I try to get that back on track? So I go above my immediate boss's head to the big, big boss. And he's like, sure, knock yourself out. Like, he didn't care. He didn't care if I failed or what. So I can remember I crafted this letter. I worked on this letter so hard. That was, hey, my name's Jason Glast. I'm a new guy. I've got this law degree. I'm like this professional. If you will allow me one chance, I'll make this right. I won't let you down, et cetera, et cetera. So I remember I had this letter FedEx to his house in a little bit north of Atlanta. I had no expectation. I never met the guy. Anyway, like a couple of days later, I get a call. Hey, Jason, Bill Goldberg, got your letter. You've got one chance. Meet me in Cleveland. So I show up to that Nitro. I meet him in person. I do my thing. That was my first, I'd say that's one of the biggest successes I've ever had. And really, it was sales. That is straight up sales right there. And, I'd say that victory helps me to this very day, what I do now. So Bill was a guy that did not tolerate fools whatsoever. Okay. And his version of who was a fool might have been a little strict compared to most people. Bill grew up with a very educated, wealthy family in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he was kind of the jock of the family. He also didn't necessarily love where his career had ended up, which was in pro wrestling instead of pro football, because he did play in the NFL briefly, I think with the Rams and the Falcons, and he had been a big player at the University of Georgia. And so I think he had that in his blood too, that, maybe he wasn't doing real sports. He was in sports entertainment. Okay. So Bill could be very challenging and difficult, but he had things which he was so good with the kids. And I believe in 1999, he and Stone Cold Steve Austin were the two most requested personalities in anything for Make-A-Wish families.
Wow.
Okay. And I would see him meet with these families, legitimately tear up, be moved, just give these families something they would never forget. He was amazing at this. Okay. And afterwards, he would often just say, I need a moment to compose himself, get ready for the show, because these were usually things that happened right before the show. And we did develop a tight relationship where I would travel just with him because he was our biggest guy, even though he was injured for quite a bit of the time that I was there. But, American Music Awards, he and I would travel out there, and I learned how to please Bill. I learned how to not be a fool. And trust me, I had to adapt to not be that fool. So I learned a lot. And, I can remember this one day we're walking on some street in LA, and all of a sudden I realized he was behind me, and he had stopped, and he was talking to a homeless person on the street. And I kind of run over there, just seeing him, what's up with that. And, he's just peeling off 5 $100 bills to give to this homeless man on the street. He did not want publicity for that kind of stuff. And that gave me this respect for him that, I think a lot of people in the industry didn't necessarily extend that to him because, he wasn't a legendary worker. He had his spear. And, if you've seen any of the recent documentaries that feature Bret Hart, you can tell that the guys that really knew how to work, they were jealous of his success and fame for essentially having one big move.
Yeah.
Okay. So at the end of the day, though, and Bill, he did have this really kind streak. So when the Super Bowl was in Atlanta, I believe in 99, it was the Rams versus the Titans. Bill was like the biggest celebrity around. I remember Leonard Skinner was playing at the Fox Theater, and they wanted Bill to introduce Skinner. So, and Bill would always be like, hey, my girlfriend's going to be with us. Bring your wife. And so my wife and I would go backstage, and I can remember I can just remember just hanging out with Travis Tritt and Doug Flutie for a long time, just these random personalities. And the biggest sports writer in America at the time was a guy named Rick Riley for Sports Illustrated. And Rick wanted to do a story about Goldberg and his fascinating background and all this stuff. And so I remember Rick came in for the Super Bowl, and I picked him up at the airport in the limo. And honestly, we were like drinking all day. And remember, I was like this wannabe small-time sports writer. And so to spend this whole day telling some of the, and he knew nothing about pro wrestling. So I'm giving him insight, and he's a fun guy. And so, yeah, we just had a ball. And later we got the limo to pick up some of Bill's best football friends from UGA. And so we've got these big linebackers who I'd watched on TV, and we're all just drinking and partying. And, times like that were just very fun, very memorable. But I hope you can understand that that's how you become a mark.
Yeah.
That is exactly how you get influenced by the guys, because many of them, they're master manipulators. They're amazing at manipulating things to their own advantage. And so I would see that over and over. Bill wasn't necessarily that much like that, but yeah. So I'd say that I truly enjoyed my time with him. And yeah, he could be difficult sometimes with me. This one time, there was a photo shoot for the cover of Atlanta magazine at his house, and it was going to be him and Kim Porter, who is a legendary, beautiful model who I believe was married to P. Diddy at the time.
Yep.
And so she had a reputation also as an extremely difficult person who would arrive very, very late to bookings. And she showed up 2 hours late to Bill's house. And Bill was starting to get very angry after she was 5 minutes late. And so those 2 hours, and really it ended up being like 4 hours, were 4 of the most stressful hours in my entire life, trying to smooth that over. When Kim arrived, I'm like, "Hi, Kim, my name's Jason. You're a little late." And she just starts screaming at me like, "Yeah, you don't look me in the eye," or something like that. It was like, just dealing with these very difficult personalities. So Charles, you can understand how residential real estate is, difficult as it can be. It still doesn't rate on that scale after you've had some of these experiences.
It's funny because I see John Mark's angst while you're telling the Bill Goldberg story about the Make-A-Wish kids, because he's the biggest, as you can see from his hat and his shirt, the biggest Bret Hart fan, and he wants to hate Goldberg, but you're just kind of melting them right now. But yeah.
And I totally understand. And, I actually enjoyed my time with Bret. He came in while I was there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, okay, don't quote me on that, because it was after the Montreal screw job, obviously. And my recollection was I was there when Bret showed up, because I don't think he went just from Montreal to the next week on WCW. I think there was some time off there. But people were genuinely excited for Bret. And Bret was a true pro, always extremely polite to me. He didn't have this like big bubbly personality, he obviously, enjoy. And he would do any media hit that I asked him to do, which I was shocked. So he did not have the ego, say, of a Ric Flair or a Hogan or a Nash. He didn't have that. And I truly appreciated that, because I knew then from me learning about the history that he and his family were truly royalty, true royalty, starting in, Calgary and the dungeon and all that stuff. That stuff, I was a history major in college. And to me, this stuff was an extension of, you're learning one day about European history. Well, guess what? Pro wrestling is a huge part of Canadian and American history,
no doubt,
of the the 20th century and 21st century now.
Yeah.
So, but of course, Bret was injured for most of the time that we were there, and they didn't know how to use him. Period. End of story.
Yeah. It's a sad story, obviously, what happened to Bret, but it's also a sad story to see Bret and Bill not getting along today. It's sad to see that. Like, I think, like Bret and Shawn kind of publicly kind of buried the hatchet. And then Bret's stroke, and, it's hard. You can't really, I don't want to speak about things I'm not, knowledgeable about, but like, he had a stroke, and, he probably had more than one concussion. He probably had a whole life of TBI,
No doubt.
And so there's just a whole bunch of sadness wrapped around that. It really is.
I agree. And I have to say, I was not aware of the beef while I was there. I wasn't. So when I heard about this in a couple of different documentaries, I could tell that was very real. I was a little surprised that I was not aware.
There's another talent I kind of wanted to throw a name down. So I grew up grew up down south, with the NWA, with the Memphis territories. And so that's why I really kind of naturally gravitated towards WCW, because there was that history, there was that connection. Jeff Jarrett. I have pretty strong emotions about Jeff Jarrett. On one hand, I feel that he was a scapegoat of the Russo era. It destroyed me to see him take the fall during Bash at the Beach 2000, because he was so good. And he came from kind of like Bret, kind of like wrestling royalty in the Memphis territories, right? Did you have any experience with Jeff? I mean, he always came across as a guy who was serious and a professional, and to see him at Bash at the Beach like lay down like that was difficult pill for me to swallow, if I'm honest.
And so, and I totally understand it. I can tell you that Jeff was a great guy, just a great guy. He would do anything for the company. He would do anything to put anyone over. If anything, I felt like maybe they made him carry the company too hard near the end, gave him too much to do with the guitar, the smashing of the guitar gimmick and all that. Yep. But man, great guy. He would do anything for kids. He would do any media request that I asked him to. So, and again, he's from wrestling royalty. I felt like his ego was just perfectly in check, which if you think about it, I don't hold it against really any of these guys if they have a big ego. You have to have some ego. You have to be successful.
Right.
But you're making a ton of money. You're on national TV every week. Not necessarily Jeff, but a lot of these guys, they're pumped up with steroids and, just other substances.
Yeah.
You can see how it can really just change people. But I felt like Jeff, who had decades before I ever even met him, he had decades in the business, really good guy.
Yeah.
Really was.
It's interesting because, I made a critical comment about Vince Russo, and I want to talk about, there's a specific thing about Vince I want to talk about, but we have to be fair, right? We have to be fair in how we look at people. And so, yeah, to me, that was one of those things where it's like, man, what's Vince doing? Even as a mark at home watching this, I'm like, what's going on here, right? However, I think on the flip side of Vince Russo's kind of legacy is the fact that he championed Booker T basically becoming the champion, and you were there for history of that night. And that sometimes I think that the work shoot between Vince and Hogan sometimes overshadows the fact that Booker T got told, according to the legend, like 10 minutes beforehand, you're going to wrestle Jarrett, you're going to be the champion, and you had a chance to kind of be front row to that. What a cool experience.
It was. And Booker was an amazing guy as well. I mean, love working with him, and the fans just adored him. I have to say, like any stereotype of wrestling fans, I didn't see it. I didn't see racism on the fans' faces with Booker T. And like, I'm a somewhat idealistic guy. So I'm just like, look at this, look how we're healing the world, where race doesn't matter and stuff like that. So, and I had kind of forgotten that Vince, was instrumental in that. Mm-hmm. Because, when Vince was hired, we were so fired up. We were so excited. We really were. We're like, this is the turning point. And it just didn't work out at all. It just didn't. And so
as I not name dropping, but I used to work in the White House, and I was in the White House during a transition of a presidential administration, right? Between one president and another after a very nasty election, right? It was fascinating to watch that dynamic. You got to see something that frankly makes me a lot more intimidated, which is seeing the changing of the guard between Vince and Eric Bischoff. And then Eric Bischoff subsequently coming in, I guess, as an advisor. Like, for the folks back behind the curtain, what was that like? Like, that must have been like a pretty tough thing to manage.
It was because, when Vince came in, it seemed very promising, but just seeing him on a daily basis, like, be very frantic, and he didn't seem in control of his emotions whatsoever. Pretty quickly, I think we thought that the Emperor had no clothes, and maybe it just wasn't going to work out. And they brought in this marketing executive named Aaron Blitzstein, who he was probably late 20s, and he was supposed to be this master of youth culture, and he didn't have a clue either. He was, it just started going downhill. We had fascinating people, though. The legendary musician Bob Mould was a writer. on our show, and like I knew him as, alternative rock, Oscar Du. He was an absolute legend, and like, I didn't know that, he was kind of into pro wrestling, and so, I got to occasionally go up and be like, hey Bob, what's going to be the card tonight, or that type of thing, and it's just random interesting characters, but that stew, it just wasn't the right recipe, and bringing in Eric again was like, I don't know, the final nail in the coffin, really.
Yeah.
Because, just so many desperate grabs to try to reclaim glory without a long.
So you came in not as a fan, you became pretty much a fan just working there. Now, after WCW dissolved, did you stay a fan? Did you follow it? Did you stay in contact with talent and people, and
No.
you watch it today?
No, I read about it today, but I can't remember the last time I've actually watched the product, but I'll read about it on social media to, see what's happening generally. Of course, I was very aware when WCW was bought out by, I can't remember if it was already WWE at the time or still WWF. And I thought that they absolutely squandered WCW. Like they messed it up so bad. And so I was because I was excited. I was excited for the talent. I thought, finally, you're going to get the first class treatment you always deserved. And it just didn't really happen that way. But, I think you probably could say that it worked out well for Booker and then maybe a few other guys, but they didn't have this long-term strategy, to make it a true brand within the brand or anything like that.
There's probably a million reasons behind that. Booker T's, like you said, is one of the only ones that made that smooth transition where that WWF locker room didn't hold it against him. They received Booker T with kind of open arms, and he came there very humble. But the other talent kind of like, hey, you're here to take my spot, screw you. And they kind of buried that talent, or they just stayed home because their contract paid them until the end of that year or whatever that contract was. So they made money regardless whether they wrestled or not.
That's right. And honestly, Booker was so talented, and, his look was also so good. So in some ways, it's like, okay, you could say, Eddie Guerrero, I mean, he was also incredibly talented, but he doesn't have that massive size and all that stuff. So I just don't think you couldn't stop Booker once he had reached a certain level. You just couldn't put him back in the box. He was so good, talented, nice person, all that stuff. And
it's always going to be a mystery to me, Jason and Charles, about WCW. I think that there's always that question about like what killed WCW, right? And the only thing I can come up with, it was like a death by 1,000 cuts. It was a bunch of different things that kind of came together, for WCW at the wrong time. But like, you think about all the advantages that WCW had. You had the talent that we knew was there and then would later go on and do, you had the capital.
And so
from Turner, right? Then you had capital from Turner, Time Warner merging. Then you had that huge media empire. They were ahead of their time in terms of the internet. Like all these things you would look at and say, they got the talent, they've got the capital, they've got the media apparatus. There is to me, there is really no reason it should have not, still shouldn't be a thing today, short of just the way it was run at the very top. That's the only thing I could come up with, not to be critical, but I'm still pulling out my hair trying to figure out like what happened.
Yeah. Well, you probably watched the documentary Who Killed WCW. I agreed with most of their different theories. Now, of course, Bischoff was very much like deflected, where, for me, he was a very big part of it. Absolutely. And so all the capital, Turner, Time Warner, though, they weren't into it. They didn't like it. And so I think they just were like, okay, your little group in Smyrna, y'all can do what you want. The fiscal irresponsibility was just massive. Mm-hmm. It really was. I couldn't believe that when they would send me on the road to Nitro, they just had a corporate credit card, and they really said, hey, my boss said, it's important that you basically buy the bar at the hotel after the show. I would have tabs in the 10,000s. So buying all the talent new, that everything was on me.
This is the 90s.
Yeah.
It equates to like 50,000 today.
Yeah. No, it was, even though I wasn't literally paying for it, it felt wasteful. Like, how can this last? And the fact is it didn't last. And then another thing that probably wasn't helpful was the Warner Brothers movie Ready to Rumble.
Mm-hmm.
That was basically like a whole year that I felt the company was more focused on that movie than producing great shows on a weekly basis. And it took some of the talent away. And then all of a sudden we had, all kinds of Hollywood hangers on. We were always trying to like we brought in Kiss, the band, for quite a while. We were always just trying to spike those ratings with
that short pop, right? Every week is that short pop instead of the long term that I think, Vince had that long term vision that, hey, listen, we may be down this week, but this long term is going to work out. Whereas WCW is just all about Monday Nitro.
That's right. And Vince could answer to himself and his family where, at the end of the day, some of the Turner executives, they would sometimes try to let WCW know, we don't like you. It's embarrassing for us that you're our top rated show, but it was, there was some pressure always.
Very interesting. My understanding of history was that Ted Turner was a fan of wrestling.
He was a fan. Yeah, he was a fan.
And he was the champion, right? And when, as you described, when they had the changeover, that the champion was no longer there to protect the business.
Yes. And from what I've read, Ted had regrets about, the merger with AOL Time Warner. It does not sound ridiculous that it was AOL Time Warner, like that AOL was the big player even over Time Warner. It's so stupid.
Yeah.
And so I think that Ted probably did have some regrets of giving up control. And then once that happened, that's when I think, Turner Sports and AOL Time Warner were trying to figure out maybe how do we divest from this? I know they weren't displeased to see it go away eventually.
Very interesting. I mean, during that time, there was the .com bubble, right? And, that probably gave them a convenient excuse.
And
probably, just another thing they can point to and say, well, we got to restructure. We have to divert capital to other areas. And, that's a tough thing to have to go through. You pour your life into a project. And I think we all can say we've had some experience with, not at that scale, but professional, when you pour your life into your work and so things beyond your control conspire to not allow you to see it through. I know that's got to be very frustrating.
Absolutely. And I'd say, and I did leave, by the way, before the end. Everybody saw the writing on the wall. Many WCW employees naively thought that they would get hired by whomever would buy us out. I never thought that. So for the last year, the first year was fun, entertaining, but when the second year rolled around and you're going to the same cities, that's when the burnout factor started to kick in big time. So I started to I would do my job before the show, and several of us would do this. We would, during the show, go back to the hotel and we would watch BWF. It was the rise of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. And we knew once he started getting all of the screen time that his work on the mic, it was just another nail in our coffin because we didn't have anybody like that. Mm-hmm. And so that was crazy. WCW employees were just like watching Raw during the show, and so there was a big burnout factor. So I started looking for a soft landing somewhere.
Yeah, that the rise of The Rock and then Stone Cold.
And so
before that, and then kind of crescendoing while WCW's kind of tanking, it was just a perfect storm. A lot of people like to blame Hogan, they like to blame Bischoff, they like to, well, whatever the case is. But like John Mark said, death by 1,000 cuts, and then your competition is on a meteoric rise with two huge talents. You just can't kind of see a perfect storm.
Yeah. And it was sad that so many people behind the scenes that I worked with, they lost their jobs. Literally had no job. Just very, very few people ended up going to WWE.
Yeah. Another talent that, is a guy that I have always enjoyed watching perform, but also I hear he's a great dude, is Sting. You have any good experience with Sting?
You know what? I really don't. And that's because Steve was injured. I want to say almost the entire time that I was there. There was a night, I think it was a pay-per-view, where he did come down from the rafters like he used to before I was there. That was, his legendary kind of entry. And when he did that, I do remember it was chills. It was chills. And I think, some of the people that had been there long before I got there, like they were crying. It was like the ultimate pop. Okay. But yeah, it was beautiful to see. But then he just went back out into mothballs. I can't remember, what that was, but it wasn't sustained after that. And I think it was because of injury.
Yeah. I think, and then, just on that, right? One guy that I just growing up, high school, rebel, 14-year-old Charles, rebelling against society, all of a sudden the NWO and Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, the Outsiders, right? And I just thought Scott Hall, Razor Ramon was the coolest dude in the world. And, 14-year-old me, and I've, been a fan ever since. What are your kind of dealings with Scott Hall, and how was he? Just curious, I think he's just like a dude. He's like the coolest dude in the room,
Yeah. So I have a real soft spot for Scott. NWO was on its last legs when I got to WCW. Scott and Kevin, I can't remember exactly their relationship. Kevin was like the true mastermind behind the scenes at that point, because Hogan wasn't around that much. So Nash and Bischoff were in charge when I first got there, for sure. So Scott at the time, he was super popular. He really was. He still looked great. Okay. Dude's like 6'5", shredded, has that long jet black hair, and he could still work. He really could. And the cool thing was he was actually dating a woman in the back office. And so on a weekly basis, there was great camaraderie between the office workers at WCW. We would go out in Atlanta at least once a week for drinks and have a good time. And Scott would often join us, just trying to be a regular dude with his girlfriend, who was one of us. And so it was kind of sweet to see him try to be a normal guy, where, we'd have our own section at a bar or something like that. And like people who weren't with our group, they're just trying to get in and get autographs, get pics or whatever. Scott, even though he was generally a heel, he was so good with fans and kids. And, I knew he had some issues with drugs and alcohol. It was obvious. And so it wasn't a big surprise when he passed away, because he had just abused his body. And, but Scott was a great dude. And yeah, it was really sad to see so many of these guys. The lifestyle nearly required you to be on prescription painkillers. These guys beat their bodies up so much to try to, elevate themselves. And to that extent, of course, the prescription painkillers were pretty devastating to a lot of the guys. But then being on the road, after you do this show, your adrenaline is so high. It's like, how do you come down from that?
Yep.
Yeah.
And that would be through alcohol. And so it would be the mixing of the painkillers and the alcohol that, eventually just, unfortunately killed a lot of these guys.
Yeah.
And women that I worked with at the time. And every time I would see that, it'd be fairly devastating.
And it amazes me the grind that they had on the road. You got painkillers, you got alcohol, you got whatever drugs, you just got the wrestling grind, but they still had to keep their bodies in shape, just ripped, probably hours in the gym every day and still traveling. So that grind, I don't know, like it's only 24 hours of the day.
None of it is surprising that it would have this devastating effect on their bodies and their minds. It's really sad, but yeah, they were spit out, used up. And yeah, I really have a lot of mixed feelings about how the industry essentially would treat the talent, where they felt compelled to do, scarier and scarier things. And, and then it's like you can judge them, but think about when you have all of that adrenaline, how are you going to come down from that? Brutal lifestyle.
And Charles and I talk about this all the time, because one of the things for this project is we don't want to become like, we want to be thoughtful in how we interpret what goes on with the business, especially when it comes to the talent, for that very reason. Because at the end of the day, like, they're entertainment for us, and marks are so fast to discard people, like when they're not as fast or when they're not as explosive, or maybe their mic skills aren't what they used to be. And it's got to be devastating to the talent especially with like now with social media, to have to pull up social media and have to listen to all these guys who couldn't lace up your boots, talk about how you suck. That's gotta, it's very sad when you think of it that way, what you just described in terms of what you have to do to try to stay on top and make money and support your family. And to, to me, what you just said just kind of reminded me just how crappy a lot of fans can be.
That's right. And before social media in 99, 2000, the version of that would be the next day when the guys would see the ratings. Mm-hmm. So if their 15-minute segment didn't pop a good number, devastating.
Yeah.
Devastating.
Interesting.
I can remember having to console talent about, that was just random. That number didn't mean anything. And they're basically like, my career's over. I'm done. Like, no, it's not. Come on, man. Like, it's just one number on one night. But they took it very hard.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, Jason, was I'm a huge fan of Japanese strong style. And I think right by the time you got there, I mean, WCW had a really strong international pipeline obviously from Mexico, you mentioned, but also in Japan. Did you have any really cool interactions with any of the talent coming out of New Japan?
So my recollection is Goldberg was actually very much into like the mixed martial arts. He knew the Japan stuff. I personally didn't know it very well, but I did go to a couple of events where they were, the big Japanese stars were there. And then some of the real grapplers, like I've forgotten their names now, but it was Mark, somebody like Goldberg was really into what he considered to be those, those guys that they could really hurt you.
Yeah.
They knew how to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So that was my experience was really through him. At just a couple of shows that we went to.
Yeah. Like a couple of names at top of my head, like the Great Muta, Ultimate Dragon. I mean, Chono, just some really good talent. Kaz as well. Just really exceptional talent. And, a lot of the WCW talent, my understanding too, they went overseas and did shows in Japan as well. And put over their stars over there, which I thought was pretty cool as well.
Yeah. I mean, there was this kind of progressive nature that did exist within WCW that it didn't get enough spotlight, frankly. And I love what we did with the Mexican wrestlers, honestly. And, it wasn't just the luchadors. We had Conan and
love Conan.
Eddie was a relatively big guy.
Yeah.
And Rey Mysterio, like that, where, these guys like Rey Mysterio and some of the high flyers, like they were small. They were small guys in stature, but our best athletes, bar none, amazing athletes.
Oh, no doubt.
And so like the office people, like we wanted them to be put over. We wanted them to succeed. So like I would use Rey for interviews all the time. Okay. Because back then he didn't wrestle with a mask very often in 99, 2000. He didn't. And so he did have his face and his personality and all that. And he was quite good.
Yeah. We mentioned the luchadors, and something I didn't really even realize, but on this journey that me and John Mark have kind of gone on, I kind of got integrated local wrestling here in San Antonio in South Texas. And the luchador, just that genre, just that lineage here is huge. And so I go to these local wrestling shows, and they're professionally ran. I mean, it's not
he didn't
WWE multi-billion-dollar corporation, but they're professionally ran. And these luchadors, these young kids, man, they are flying. And I remember, like, I didn't even know what a luchador was until WCW, until I saw Rey Mysterio, Conan, and that whole, it was an international flavor that you didn't get in WW. And so I just remember that starkly, like as a teenager, as a young kid, watching WCW and be like, who are these masked dudes? What's a luchador? And I just see him flying off ropes and doing crazy stunts. And I'm just like, wow. And I was just so intrigued. And it's kind of come full circle, 30 years later, watching it here in San Antonio, and it's, it's just exciting.
That's great. We'll have to go to a show. I went to one maybe about 20 something years ago when I first moved here. It was some place called Club Splatch, 37 South. Yeah. And I expected this amateur nothing, and it was actually very good.
Yeah,
It
same here.
really
Same here.
was.
I was so impressed. And it was in a Lutheran church on the south side.
That's so cool.
Amazing, though. Like, amazing. I think I sent John Mark a video.
Yeah.
Just doing insane stunts. And the kid's probably 18 years old. And just, man, yeah, so impressive.
Jason, I wanted to ask you about the women's division. The women's division today is stacked. I mean, it's just amazing looking at the roster and how much the women's division has grown since you were there. Were there any women talent that were there at the time that really kind of like struck you as talented, just a good person you enjoyed working with?
Medusa was somebody, and she was a great interview, so I used her all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But we also had a monster truck division. I don't know if you remember, like, that we would have, like, you know, we were trying to branch out into all these different revenue streams. And so monster truck was one of those. So Medusa was actually heavily involved in that. Otherwise, I would say it was more about, okay, the Nitro girls and Tori Wilson are going to fight. And honestly, they did take it seriously, the training to try to learn moves and things like that. But it was nothing like today. Nothing at all. And so, yeah, it was still probably more about how attractive they were and that type.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it was just like maybe the beginnings of what it is today, but we didn't really ever take it to that extent where we're platforming their in-ring talent.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned Medusa. I have to ask the question, were you on board when she took the belt to WWF, or was that before you arrived?
I think before.
Okay.
Pretty sure before.
All right.
Yeah.
Sorry, my history was off on that.
No, I don't recall that.
Yeah. You're right. She was really ahead of her time in many regards. She was very athletic, and she could wrestle. Like,
yeah, great. I mean, so much, you know, very muscular, you know, so she had size and skill. She did. And she was pretty good on the mic, and like I said, just easy to get her to do an interview.
Yeah.
Like, some of how I favor people or don't favor them is how quick they were to say yes when I needed them to do an interview. And, you know, some of the guys, I would just have to figure out what is their soft spot. Again, it's kind of sales training. Like, what is their soft spot? So for Hogan, for example, like you can never count on him to do any market that was like smaller than New York or LA, basically.
Doesn't work for me, brother.
Yeah, no Cleveland, brother. But occasionally I was able to get around that by saying, you know what, there is a Make-A-Wish family that wants to meet you there. And to his credit, he would say, let's do it then. Let's do it. And he was good with them. Ric Flair never could break through with him. No, there was nothing I could do to move Ric Flair to do anything.
Yeah.
But I think there was the woman on our PR team, she was able to get him to do things. That just could have been the message that whoever was delivering the message did not inspire him.
Totally your fault, Jason. I hold you accountable.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he was the one that, and you know, so many people that they don't really know wrestling, but they will know of Flair.
Yeah.
And when I hear the woo, you know, at every sports event now, it makes me cringe. I hate it so much because I didn't.
Yeah, understand. But I don't think too many people did back in those days. You know, and it could be, you know, it's Ric Flair, and it could be the substances. It could be just him being Ric Flair. But yeah,
it's like he's a natural heel. Natural heel, but to me, there's a fine line between the children want to talk to you, and it's just like, no, I'm not doing it.
I mean, it's that is not surprising at all to hear that. And you know, growing up down south territories, he was the man. And you know, he was the first bad guy I rooted for. There was something about him that, you know, I know what it was. It was the whole, like, the promos were sick, right? I mean,
so good.
Yeah,
so
good. But like, you know, I have this rule, and I'm breaking it with this journey, Charles, which is don't try to get to know your heroes. And you know, just my personal opinion, you know, he's one of those cases where it's like the more I read about him, it's like, man, I just think I'd rather just stop learning more about Ric Flair and just enjoy, you know, what he did as his character, right?
That's what I would recommend. But his son, David, who wasn't very talented on the mic or in the ring, he was a very nice guy when I was there. Okay. He would do anything very pleasantly. So yeah, it just,
No, it's kind of like I grew up as a Hulkamaniac as a little kid, right? Hulk Hogan was the golden years and the 80s. And then you find out later Terry Bollea is not the best dude in the world, right? And so, yeah. I mean,
I really only had,
we're all complicated. There's layers to everything.
Of course.
But
yeah,
yeah.
I only had one big experience with
Hulk.
which was I was to fly with him from Atlanta to LA for a Time Warner cable, all the heads of all the local Time Warner cable affiliates, they have these big conventions, and the different actors and comedians and talent from all the shows, they go out there and do their little show for them. So I was pretty nervous about this trip, and Hulk's best friend, I cannot remember the guy's name right now, but he was in charge of all the stunts at WCW. And he was a very friendly, nice guy. And so I asked his advice, and he's like, hey, you can call him Terry or you can call him Hulk. That's fine. And, just be a professional. It'll be fine. And so, yeah, I just remember, flying out there with him. And before, I remember there was a ring that was built in this convention hall. And he was going to do a 5-minute gimmick talking to the local cable poo boss. And I just remember, I'm like, Hulk, do you need anything before you go on? He's like, brother, give me 2 bottles of Merlot, please. I'm like, wine? Red wine you're talking about? Yeah, 2 bottles of Merlot. So I bring back the 2 bottles of Merlot, and I just watch him pop the cork and just guzzle both of them with his big hands, just 2 bottles right down the hatch. He gets out there and just, nails his Hulkamania stuff out there, because he was not NWO at all when I was there.
He wasn't. Okay. No, that's that's probably the most vivid memory of me is when he turned heel. He came over to WCW and turned heel with the Outsiders.
And that was a great gimmick, wasn't it? I mean, it was time. They hit that right.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, amazing story. Hell yeah.
I want to be respectful of your time, Jason, because leave it up to me and Charles. This conversation will go until sun up tomorrow morning.
I'm good.
I wanted to ask you, kind of like take a step back and take a look at the industry, at a whole. I know you're not following it right now, but like as you're seeing society change, with social media, with AI, with all these, like, I guess you can say, like, communities now in our country that are becoming divided. Like, how do you see the next evolution of the business, given kind of like the direction that society is going right now? Like, what do you think is going to connect emotionally with fans and help the industry continue to grow and stay relevant?
It's a great question. And obviously, the McMahons are, maybe troubling best is the way to say it. So,
yep.
I don't know what other promotions are vital right now besides WWE.
Mm-hmm.
And, so I don't know exactly where you take, sports entertainment. Is it even fair to call it sports entertainment? Do people even use that term today? You guys tell me, because I'm not even sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's still considered sports entertainment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
it is different just because it's a publicly traded company now, right? So
he would,
you have to please the investors. So it's just a little different, right? And that's kind of like our journey is like, hey, we're trying to figure out what's missing, right? Because today's wrestling is, you have the greatest athletes in the world, the greatest production in the world, billions of dollars behind it, but it doesn't hit like the WCW of old, right? It just doesn't hit the same. And, that's kind of like what we're searching for.
And I mean, there's no doubt that WWE benefited from its rivalry with WCW. Those Monday Night Wars were absolutely probably the peak of attention on the industry. But there are things I noted, like it seemed like a lot of people were pretty satisfied with John Cena's conclusion. Although I did not know who the Gunther guy was.
Don't get me started.
Like, I'm so out of it.
Yeah, don't get me started. But John Mark was actually there live in DC for his last match.
It's cool.
Yeah. Well, how did you feel about it?
So I did a little bit of a rant on our channel about it. I think the issue for me wasn't the fact that he lost, because I think wrestling history like we do, which
gotta be,
you give up the strap or you lose your last match to put someone else over. That's the way it goes. I think it was the way it happened. Or give up, taps out in the middle of the ring. It's not how I envisioned it. And it honestly, man, like it sucked the life out of the crowd.
What was the psychology behind Mr. Never Gives Up giving up? Like, what were they thinking?
That's the issue. I mean, I think that everyone has the fan, all the marks had the signs. Like if Cena loses tonight, we riot. Like we always see that stuff, right? I generally feel that 90% of the people in there would have been just fine with him losing, but to lose in that way. And then like when Triple H came out, with all the talent to do, it missed the moment because people were booing, people were angry. It shouldn't have been like that. And when they were doing like his screen, his montage of his life, you could hear a pin drop, and not in a good way. I really felt that they missed a moment with that.
How would you have booked it?
How would I have booked it? That's a good question.
Like, would he have been injured and Gunther cheated or something like that?
I would have been happy with a clean pin. Honestly. A DQ would have probably pissed me off somewhat, honestly, but I probably would have gone with a clean pin. What about you, Charles? Maybe even a different booking altogether, a different opponent.
Booking altogether, I'm not a fan of Gunther. I don't get it, but Gunther's move is the sleeper hold, right? Rear naked choke, sort of. So that was him giving up, is like he had him in a chokehold. And so that was just, it didn't hit the mark, and it had no build up behind it. It felt kind of rushed. And the thing is, now you can see behind the scenes more with different Netflix and what was that? What's that?
Unreal.
So different series that they kind of have peek behind the scenes. And basically Triple H is saying is that was Cena's call. This last Cena's last ride was all Cena's call. Because Cena turned heel for a second. I don't know if you knew, Jason. Like, he turned heel for a second. And people are like, oh shit, okay. Like, and then he just, like, with no build-up or no nothing, no warning, he's like a good guy again. And so it just missed, like,
it felt rushed, it sounds like.
Yeah, it would just.
Okay,
yeah.
he would.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Maybe not a clean pin. Maybe like as you said, like a grab him by the trunks. I'm really dating myself here. These are 1980s moves, but foot on the rope, something like that. I think would have been more satisfying. But again, I would not have cared if it was a clean pin and Gunther got out of the ring and moved out. I would have been fine with that. But I think now in the modern product, it's becoming more fashionable. Like, here's a great one. Remember, Charles, you probably remember this. It was Ric Flair's, like, not his real last match, but it was one of his many last matches. The one with Shawn.
Yeah, he super kicked
him. And Rick his knees are buckling. He's got his fist up. He's like, come on. And everyone knew what was getting ready to happen.
He's got covered in blood. And then, Shawn Michaels is like, I'm sorry. And he super kicks him.
I love you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Great ending. A guy got to his feet and gave his last measure, right? Then there was like Stone Cold not tapping to Bret Hart, right? But covered in blood and passing out to the sharpshooter. Great ending of a great match, right? To me, that's how you send off a legend. Not, AJ Styles and John Cena's exits by way of Gunther. I'm going to be honest, I'm marking out a little bit here. I didn't find it to be very emotionally satisfying.
Is Gunther currently a monster heel?
I'll let Charles handle that one.
They're trying to book him that way, and that's the push he's getting. But he's just, to me, he's not believable, and it's, I don't get it, man. He's a big guy. He's from Eastern Europe or Vienna or whatever. So there's that, and we talk about the psychology, right? So there's those undertones. Let's be honest, there's those like Eastern European, almost Nazi German undertones to him. Gunther, and he has an accent, right? Very disciplined and structured. So he has those undertones, but I think because it's a publicly traded company, they can't turn that up a notch. So it's still kind of mute, right? Whereas back in the WCW days, man, we could turn that, we could turn that up to 10 and not get canceled and be okay. Whereas today, the investors ain't going to like that.
Jason, Charles brought up a great point the other day, and it's a huge change that we haven't really talked about, which is now the big dog, BWE, is part of TKO. And since, when you first got to WCW, I think UFC was obviously it's very early stages. We're talking like those very minimalist shows. They were basically recorded.
Hoist Gracie in Alabama. Yeah.
Okay. So that was what Goldberg and we would go to UFC stuff and the Gracie brothers. Now I recall. Yeah. Anyway, I digress. Go ahead.
So I think what has changed now is that UFC is like, it's a global thing. It's so popular. So now, to Charles's point, selling takes on a whole nother level, right, for believability. If a rear naked choke is not to even look remotely real, it just falls flat, right? I think it's a huge change right now. It's got to be a lot more difficult for the talent to try to work, to make their product seem more believable when you have all these young fans who grow up watching UFC.
That's really an interesting point. That's got to be challenging. What does BWE or other wrestling talent, what do they do to make it either look authentic or to do something different?
Yeah, you have to evolve. Yeah, you just have to evolve somehow, Like I said, the 8-year-old me of seeing a sleeper hold and thinking it's real works because I had no clue. I didn't know any different. But now the 10-year-old that's training Brazil and jiu-jitsu down at the local MMA place knows exactly what a rear naked choke is and what this and that does. And so they say Gunther put somebody in a sleeper hold. They're just like, what is this? Right.
That's a great point. And I think that makes it a challenge for the future.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point.
I mean, how do you get, and I think one of the other things too, that Charles and I have kind of learned in this voyage, and we're not, by all means, if we're wrong, we'd love to be told. It seems to be very like spot heavy right now, the product. And I think a lot of that's just the Instagram and, social media.
Okay. Viral moments.
Yeah. And what do you sacrifice from that? Well, you sacrifice storyline. We were talking about promos from a previous episode from Raw. Maybe it was SmackDown. I can't remember, Charles and we were texting back and forth, and the term unwatchable was used twice for some of the promos,
Okay.
They just weren't working, man. There's some good promos today, but it's harder to find. Whereas when you were there at WCW, some phenomenal promos. As a PR guy, what are you looking for in a good promo? What's a good promo? What's a bad promo?
I can just tell you so many times. I mean, honestly, when I was there, they would fall flat more often than not. Like, I feel like Jericho, he was a guy that he's really not that physically big, not that different than me or something, but we just loved him on the mic. And the whole office would just mark out for Jericho. Jericho had us in the palm of his hand.
Nice.
But couldn't make his way though, because the powers that be, which by the way became an angle, the powers that be really held him down.
Yeah.
Just, didn't like him. But so I would say some of our struggles were that, our promos weren't as good as WWE. And like I said, we would stop everything to watch The Rock because he was just so entertaining and effortless and easy, where trying to think our stuff was just more hack, more done before, people struggling. Scott Hall was good. He was good. But overall, I think that we fell flat compared to our competition during those years.
Did you observe the talent like coming up with the promos themselves, or were this just okay, cool? So it wasn't
I would see them working backstage to come up with it, and there's some people like Chris that we just knew he was going to nail it, but others that were so talented, like Vampiro, who English was his second language. Honestly, he deserved a lot of credit because he became adequate. Not great, but adequate. And that's really all he needed for his gimmick and his work rate. He just needed to be adequate, and he was. And I remember one time Sports Illustrated for Kids essentially allowed me to decide. They wanted Goldberg on their cover, but they wanted one more wrestler. And they said, we wanted somebody that's got a wild look, something that's just, so memorable and attention-getting. So I'm like, it's Vampiro. And I sent whoever I was dealing with at Sports Illustrated his headshots, and they're like, perfect. That's great. Exactly. Let's book it. This shoot's going to be in San Diego. And then I told Bill, and Bill's like, no, I'm not going to be on the cover of a major national magazine with Vampiro. Do you not understand different levels of stature? I'm like, I do, but he's right on that verge, and this is going to help him reach that next level. So anyway, that got nixed. And so I ended up getting Scotty Steiner. And the idea of Scotty Steiner being on Sports Illustrated for Kids. Oh man, I think I've got it. I think I've got the cover in this closet back here.
That's hilarious. Sports Illustrated for Kids.
I wish I'd remembered to bring some of that memorabilia out. And that's where, I traveled from South Padre Island to San Diego, just me and Scott. It worked out fine, but I knew, like, legitimately, the office also, we did want Scott Steiner to succeed. Okay. And he did to a large extent, but we wanted him to be like right there with Bill and Nash. But, he probably had some emotional things and a few traffic accidents and maybe beating up the person that he was in the accident that just limited how far he could go.
Yeah.
Okay, he did kind of live his gimmick, but his physical look, I don't know, as far as a heavyweight, that anyone's ever beaten that physical look.
Yeah.
And so we were like, this freaky, crazy muscular look. And he, from the way I looked at it, for his look, he was adequate enough on the mic. Not great, but as good as he needed to be, if he wasn't maybe a little bit of a risk to put out there. Okay, he would, but
so you being a highly
for him to be on the kids magazine, hot.
Well, I mean, you could teach them math as well, right? Sports Illustrated for kids, and you can teach them math.
Yeah, I mean, he might have learned some of that, but and by the way, at the same time, we went ahead and did like a bodybuilding magazine shoot. I can't remember which it was, where there were motorcycles, and then there was this female model. From that shoot, she ended up becoming a character on the show. It was the first time that any of us had ever seen her. I can't remember her name right now, but just there were missed opportunities, I thought, along the way. And of course, I wasn't the ultimate decision maker for who was going to get the push, and I could only try to be slightly influential.
You being a highly educated guy, I can see Scott Steiner's math promo. You being behind the scenes with the calculator at the end, you're like, damn, that shit checks out.
Okay, honestly, I wasn't great at math, so it made a lot of sense to me.
There's thousands of Scott Steiner questions. I'll just ask one. I remember a memorable promo where he really laid into Flair. And it's the one where he basically said, like, when you walk down the ramp, people are going to be turning the channel to the competition. He actually said WWF. Were you there for that? And what was the fallout from all that?
Okay, I can't remember exactly the fallout, but the office staff was so excited about it.
Wow.
We were rooting him on every step of the way, because it was real. It was a true shoot. It truly was. And so we were all like, yes, we were fired up over that for sure. So
Scott seems like most of his was shoots regardless, and he just didn't care.
Yeah.
It was just,
yeah.
Yeah.
But overall, good impression of him, really. And then when my son, was probably like 11 or 12 years old, he was just like, Dad, I want to show you this video. And it was the Steiner math video. And maybe that was, I can't remember, might have been the first time I'd ever seen it, but it just gave him so much joy. I'm like, let me tell you about Sports Illustrated for kids. And I've got this magazine cover I got to show you. So that was a little bonding. I've been very selective about what I've shared with my kids about, that experience. Sure. I don't know how much they actually cared, but yeah.
Okay. Maybe Charles was relaying what you had kind of shared with him, but he told me that Scott Steiner's like Scott Steiner, the man, is very different than his character. He's not like a crass meathead, that he's a pretty good dude.
Yeah. I mean, he wasn't a crass meathead, but he still had a hair trigger kind of temper.
Okay, so the temper.
I can remember when I was traveling with him out to California, I remember trying to curry his favor by, proactively being like, Scott, I can't believe they're not pushing you, man. And he would just be like, I know it. And I remember he had like these little bodybuilding candies that he was eating, so he'd be like eating these little candies, these little sugar things that probably spike his insulin that helped muscle growth. I don't know. And he'd be like, I know it, brother. It's just ridiculous. I'm getting, and he was, I can't remember who he was complaining about in the back office specifically, but I was like, exactly, Scott. I got you.
I mean, what are you going to do? Disagree with him at the moment while he's,
Okay, no, but it was like, in a way, that was self-preservation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay?
Absolutely.
It was like, I'm going to get on your level. I'm going to be your biggest supporter as we spend this day and a half together.
So I think we've talked ad nauseum about your experience, working in the WCW and Thank you so much for sharing, giving us a little bit of a taste of what's behind the curtain. It was a fascinating conversation. I did want to talk a little bit about, like, after WCW, you had some decisions to make about what you wanted to do, like with the future. You've obviously wound up now in real estate down in South Texas, which is awesome. But did you ever at any point have any ideas about maybe going to a different sport or to going to another company? What was your path kind of after you left WCW?
Yeah. So my next step was that I did join the legal department of CNN.
Okay.
So I went from Smyrna to the CNN Center, and that was actually through a San Antonio connection. The job posting was, law degree and some sports background. And I found out that the attorney that was hiring the position was from San Antonio. I had not yet lived in San Antonio, but my mom had moved there and I was there frequently. And I applied for this job, and then it just so happened that flying back from San Antonio to Atlanta, I see the attorney who's hiring the position. I knew what she looked like, Monica Franklin. And Monica knew nothing about sports, nothing, and she cared less. And so she couldn't care less about it. So she was just like, all right, you're a San Antonio guy. You're on this plane with me. You have a law degree. You know sports. You can deal with these people. So you got it. You got the job. It sounded kind of exciting on paper, but really it was me in that legal department being the police for the marketing departments of WCW, Cartoon Network, CNN, and the Atlanta Braves, Hawks, and Thrashers. So they would have to run their advertising by me to make sure that they, for example, weren't doing something that would be an illegal lottery. So there was a specific way. It's that incredibly small language that says no purchase necessary, void in everywhere but Puerto Rico or something like that. That language is to prevent a promotion from becoming an illegal lottery. Okay. Now, I am not well suited for this. This is very minutia, fine print kind of stuff. I am not well suited for it at all. So I went through that. I did it for about a year where, I was dealing, with WCW on their very last months, dealing with old friends of mine and saying, okay, you gotta make this typeface, 8-point instead of 4-point, stuff like that.
Wow.
I mean, my goodness, I can remember that. Okay. My wife and I went into a convenience store and I grabbed this Snickers and it had like a sweepstakes entry on it. And I was like, honey, look, it says no purchase necessary. It's void in DC and Puerto Rico. Why do you think they did that? And she's like, honey, I don't know, but this is the most boring thing I've ever heard. You got to get out of this job. This is so incredibly boring. And then I started to, in a way, get in trouble because I started to be like, how come y'all are using that color? Why are you using this background? I started to try to do the marketing people's jobs instead of being their legal advisor. And they'd say, why do you care? How does this have to do with the law? And so that's when I was like, I got to get out of here. And so we decided, it was right before we had our first child, that we wanted to be near family. And that was either in Dallas or San Antonio. We chose San Antonio. I'm very glad we did.
That's awesome.
Nowadays, so I know you keep up with it, right? You're obviously aware of the WWE.
I read about it.
You read about it. And it's funny, you going into WCW, or you really going into Turner, wanted to become in sports, right? PR in sports, sportscaster. You kind of got shuffled to WCW, which was kind of wrestling, which was kind of a downgrade in people's eyes, right? Now, WWE, the product is mainstream. Like, it's as mainstream as it gets. I mean, it's almost as popular as the NFL. It's just funny how that you see that lineage and see that transition, and if you stayed with it, where would you be, right? So
absolutely. But remember, even back then, we were the highest rated show of all time on the major cable networks, TNT and TBS. But the Turner people, the Time Warner people, it was like that was a curse to them. They thought it was so beneath. Trust me, by then, I did not think it was beneath anything. I thought it was so fascinating. Live television, the storytelling that was necessary, the emotions, the real drama was backstage. And that's something it's hard to tell the average person about. No, this was like this live show. You could say it was like a Broadway show where, the understudy's trying to get ahead of the lead, in the show. And like, there's all this, scheming and things like that goes on. And so that part was so fascinating. And The Office gossip that we would be talking about. And, sometimes it would be like in the office, we'd be like, okay, yeah, you know what? Chavo deserves the second hour. And someone's like, no, Chavo's, his look isn't good enough. He's not big enough. So it would be like, yes, we became the ultimate marks.
Yeah.
As insiders in a way, I can remember so many times we're just having beers and we're getting into arguments about what talent should be elevated versus downgraded. And to me, that was exciting and fascinating. It really was.
That's, it's funny because like when I hear Jason, you talk about this, and I'm sure Charles feels the same way. It's like, dude, that's a dream job. I would like do that for free. Right. Yeah. But it's funny. A guy like you who wasn't a mark when you came in, I think in many ways would actually do a lot better job running the business, because like if you were a real mark, you'd be so like led by your emotions and, the whole instinct to do fantasy booking and everything. Whereas someone like yourself came in and you were thinking like business, it's a business outcome, right? And you viewed things through a different lens than Charles or I would.
Right. At the start, but trust me, I became a mark. And we did all kinds of fantasy booking. And, it was like we had our favorites, people that treated us well versus people that didn't. And I would just say if it wasn't such a shit show when I was there, I could have stayed longer. I mean, the environment was so toxic after a while that, I just had to find a different place to land. That was
such a shame.
But if it had been a functional corporation, I could have stayed there, and maybe I would have, taken my boss's place at one point, and, because there were all these fun perks, but it just was too toxic.
I say it's a shame, and I don't mean to be overly dramatic, but like, some of my fondest wrestling memories came out of WCW. While you were there, right before you were there, I always joke with Charles, like the most exciting year in sports for me was Sammy Sosa, Mark McGuire, home run race, the Attitude Era, WCW Nitro, Monday Night Wars, Michael Jordan.
The 90s were huge, just so exciting.
Yeah, there's something about that time. It all just like clicked for me. And I know every old guy says that, right? But I really mean it. Like it was just an exciting time. And you were part of a project that I think it changed, regardless of what happened, it changed the business as we know it today. And if anything, it made WWE what it is today. Well, it made WWE from a business perspective what it is today. I think in many respects, WWE is a far inferior product, my personal opinion, than WCW was while you were there. WCW Nitro. Just some fantastic wrestling and characters that came out of that time. But that is what it is.
I wouldn't ever change anything about it. I can, look back and just say, if that had happened. But really, I do cherish those memories. And I am very grateful that y'all have given me this platform tonight, because I get joy in recounting those memories. And I have not that many people in my world right now that understand any of it. So I really thank you.
No, our pleasure, man. I was really contemplating sending you an invite. I didn't know if you were going to you've commented on Facebook, certain wrestling stuff. So I'm like, all right, he's still kind of a fan. He's still cool with it, and I didn't know, but yeah, as soon as you replied to the email, I was like, oh man, he's in, he's all the way
like in a hot second. And, I've done occasional social media references to it just to see if anybody will bite. And, they rarely ever do. It's almost like, well, that's weird. What was that? But you can't get it unless you really paid attention in the 90s to what was happening. And, it was a worthwhile thing to pay attention to. It is true American culture.
Absolutely.
For better or for worse.
Absolutely.
It really is. Okay. He would.
Absolutely.
Well said.
Okay. He would.
We'll leave it on that. I appreciate your time, Jason. This was amazing. Learned so much, and no, I just thank you.
No, I thank you guys for doing it, and I'll tune in now in the future to see what y'all are going to talk about. So I look forward to that.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Jason. Amazing work.
All right, y'all have a good one.
All right,
Take care.
You. Good night.